this week the Democrats sat in Congress in order to fight for gun control bills they wanted to introduce, and were being blocked in doing so by the Democrats. Now, here to talk to us about that is Ryan Cooper. Ryan is a national correspondent with TheWeek.com, and he's written for a number of other publications as well. If you don't know his work, you should. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, listen, you wrote a couple pieces about the Democrats and their response to the Orlando shooting, specifically the bills they were introducing. We had first Senator Chris Murphy's filibuster in the Senate, and then this sit-in in the House. And your pieces on this kind of echoed or gave voice to a concern I'd had about that. You wrote in one piece, for example, that they were selling gun control with Dick Cheney-esque terror baiting. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the big problem that everyone is upset about, well, not everyone, I suppose, but what I was upset about was that they're using this the secret watch list method to expand the number of people who could be banned from buying a gun. And the problem with that is that there's no real judicial process for adding someone to the list or for getting off of it. And, most liberals probably wouldn't care, about that in and of itself, simply because, they just don't really care about gun rights. Like a lot of people just deny that gun rights, really matter. A lot of people disagree with that, of course, but I think the real problem is that the way that this legitimizes the use of secret watch lists as an instrument of policy. And, all the Democratic partisans are, saying, oh, this is the good thing that we're now doing. And anyone who disagrees, is literally Elizabeth Warren was saying that her Senate opponents, Republicans, they want to sell guns to ISIS, and just extreme rhetoric that, it's like 2002 when they were selling the Iraq War. And I think that that's really dangerous for Democrats to be endorsing that line of reasoning and that policy.
Well, let me tell you what my concerns were about this angle of attack, and we'll see where and how your and my concerns intersect. My initial reaction was that they've really been pushing this, they call it the no-fly, no-buy bill, that says that if you're on the no-fly list, you should not be allowed to buy a gun or variations thereof. You should need extra permission or whatever. My feeling is there are a couple big concerns I have with that. Number one, that is characterizing the Orlando shooting as a terror incident by a potential terrorist, when it's at least arguable that even though the guy pledged allegiance to ISIS, that this was more of a disturbed lone shooter. So I felt it was feeding into the right-wing national security frame that says everything we should worry about in our lives has to do with terrorism, and the terrorists are going to endanger our way of life, when really there were other ways to address gun violence and the gun issue that might be more direct and more effective. So I felt it was pushing a right-wing frame, and frankly, I felt it was a case of Democrats once again trying to be too clever by half, by pinioning their opponents from both the right and left, rather than just speaking to the heart of the issue. I think they always wind up pushing their opponent's framing rather than their own, and thinking that they're being clever when they do it. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think those are both really good points. I mean, I haven't kept super up to date on all the latest discoveries on the Orlando shooter's background, but yeah, I mean, it certainly seems arguable, at least, that he was maybe just someone who was really, sexually insecure and sort of latched on to ISIS as the most offensive thing that he could, say to, just go out in a kind of blaze of attention. But yeah, you look at other mass shooters, a lot of them are just regular old disgruntled white men, who don't have any connection to, Islamic terrorism, at least.
Right.
And it's, of course, another problem with the no-fly list is you don't get put on there if you're like a white nationalist who wants to overthrow the government. It's pretty much mostly Muslims. But yeah, just like, I mean, especially when you're doing, I could see maybe doing like saying, okay, well, we got to accept the conservative frame in some way, if you're going to actually pass something. But what seems, obvious here is it's just a symbolic, messaging thing. Why not just stand on principle so that you don't alienate, the ACLU and all the civil liberties people and the, Council on American Islamic Relations and so forth,
and potentially feed fear of Muslims and brown people in the process, which is my underlying concern about all this. I guess I would say, when it comes to gun rights, I mean, I don't know if we disagree or not there. I know in your piece you point out that, the Supreme Court, that we have a right, not to be subject to unreasonable seizures in terms of our property. I guess that's certainly true. I hadn't thought about it that way. On the other hand, there are certain substances and, poisons, for example, toxic poisons, and I suppose I'm not allowed to buy an M1 tank or whatever. Right? So, I mean, isn't it possible to say, well, certain objects, in order to own them, you need to meet certain requirements?
Oh, absolutely. No, I don't. I'm not against, like gun control. I think you could, you could go way more aggressive than this terror watch list thing. There's hundreds of thousands of people on the watch list, but there's 310 million people in the country. This only covers a small fraction of the population. I saw somebody joking on Twitter that it would be a lot more effective if he said only people who are on the list can buy guns and everyone else is restricted. But yeah, right. I mean, it's just how you do it. It's like the Supreme Court says that people have a positive right to own, firearms. But if you were to say a federal regulation based on some safety thing is like, okay, semi-automatic rifles and shotguns and handguns are now banned, and like we're going to buy back all of the ones that exist, which costs a ton of money. But that would, from what I've read, that would probably be constitutional, because it would, you would still preserve the right to bear, some kind of arms. You'd just be sort of redrawing the line where you say it's safe. You can't buy rocket launchers, and now you can't buy, fully automatic rifles, and
right.
Then you can't buy semi-automatic, something like that.
Yeah.
Just like you can't say like these. You lose your right to buy any firearm, and we're not going to tell you why or how you got on the list or how you can get off. There's like some weird secret court or something.
Right. We're talking.
That's the real issue, I think.
Yeah, I agree. We're talking with Ryan Cooper, who is national correspondent for TheWeek.com. And I guess part of what, besides the fact that this is, well, let me put it this way. One of the things that concerns me is when the Democrats act symbolically on behalf of a bill that's not going to pass. I think you basically said this, but rather than just saying what it is they want and going to the mat for that, since it's not going to pass. If what makes sense is a ban on assault weapons, is universal background checks, is letting the CDC study the epidemiology of gun violence, then why not go to the mat for that? I just don't get it.
Yeah, and in fact, they had the CDC, funding, because the House Republicans sort of quasi banned them from doing any research on gun violence a while ago. And this, one of their three bills would have given the CDC a bunch of money to do research on guns, which is like very needed. There's all sorts of stuff that like open questions that haven't been researched in 20 years. And they took it out. I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense. I guess it just seems like no one cares about research. But when you're talking about like formulating a policy that could actually figure out like how the best way to reduce gun violence, like you got to have the information. You're flying blind, and you can't just, it sort of reminds me of the war on crime. Like when people just really flipped out about murders and assaults, and did all these really punitive crime policies and locked up millions of people literally. And later on down the road, it turned out that there's a pretty good chance that the whole problem was caused by lead poisoning. That it was leaded gasoline and leaded paint that was giving people brain damage and increasing the crime rate. And it's like, man, you can't just fly off half-cocked on a complex issue like this. Like, you got to know what the, underlying issue is about, or you're just, good chance you'll make things worse.
Yeah, and I think in a situation like this, I'm also worried about making the narrative worse. And the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, it's feeding into the narrative of fear of terrorism rather than fear of, indiscriminate availability of assault weapons. And I'll tell you one thing, and we're talking with Ryan Cooper of theweek.com. I'll tell you one thing that bothers me, and I'd like your thoughts on it, Ryan, is, sometimes I hear the argument, I've heard it from Democrats this week, that, well, whatever the flaws of this terrorist watch list idea, it would have prevented the tragedy in Orlando. Well, you can point to any tragedy and come up with all sorts of restrictions on basic freedoms that would have prevented it. You can say, you could arguably say that a law against, for example, giving guns to people who appear to be sexually conflicted might have prevented the tragedy. You can, blatantly prejudicial laws about people whose ancestry is from certain parts of the world might have prevented it. That to me is also a slightly Dick Cheney-esque argument to say it would have prevented this tragedy. I don't know but I know I'm on thin ice saying that. So I don't know. What do you think about that point?
Well, I think that's a fair retort. You can't just seize on whatever like identity of the most heinous crime and use that to justify like a prejudice policy. You could say the same thing about just a ban on, say, Muslim, like a Trump-style ban on
right.
Muslims owning weapons at all. And I think that what people should justify is to say, here's a just gun policy. Now, how might that have, prevented this massacre, rather than just, using it as sort of like a cheap shot against someone who doesn't support. Who doesn't believe that, Bush terror politics is the way to go.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I hope we can get away from this Bush terror politics and start really addressing the heart of the problem. So, listen, Ryan Cooper, national correspondent for theweek.com. Thanks for coming on the program and talking about this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.